Talos 1.9 now has the feature of an image cache, and this is a way to pre-bake container images into your installation media. This is helpful for things like air-gapped installs, or even just wanting to speed up your installation process if maybe your internet connectivity is limited or metered. What you can do is you can take a list of images and pre-bake them into your install disk, and then when you do the installation, that automatically gets used by the Talos installer and Kubernetes to run workloads. Let me show you how to do it and how to walk through all the steps so that we can understand just what it is that it's doing and then figure out how to troubleshoot some things as well. Okay, so let's start with nothing. I have nothing in this directory here. Is completely empty. We're just gonna start from scratch. The first thing we need to do is we need to collect what images we need. What images are we going to bake into this installer so that we're going to use them later. And for Talos control, if you're using just the default images, we give a handy command for that. You can run Talos control images defaults, and you'll see a list of the default container images that Talos needs to start a Kubernetes cluster. This includes the default CNI of Flannel, etcd, all the things that you might need to get a Kubernetes API to the bare minimum of what we consider as a healthy cluster. We can take this list of images and we can just put it in a text file. So we're just going to put that directly in this images.txt file, and now I have it saved for reference later. And if I want to add any other container images, if I have a different CNI or I want a storage driver or anything I want inside of my Kubernetes cluster, I append it to this file. I just put it in there, and that's going to download those images during my installation media process and bake them into the image. This also includes things like if you have private registries, if you need to go out and fetch images from a private registry, and maybe you don't want the machine to be able to do that. Only my developer workstation can do that. I can do that. If I have access to the registry, I can pull down the image, I can bake it into the actual installation media, and then when it's being reseeded back into Talos to use it, there isn't authentication on it. So this is a local registry. If you need authentication, if you want to protect those assets, don't do this. But that's something to consider as we're going out and building it. So now let's create the image cache. So let's download all of the blobs, all of the things that exist in a container registry. We want those on my file system. And to do that, we're going to take that images file that we just created, and we're just going to cap that into standard input here. The Talos control command has a create cache subcommand. You do need Talos control 1.9. So if you don't have 1.9, install it to do a brew upgrade, whatever it is, because you'll need that for this subcommand. And then we're going to say where we want to store it, and we're going to store it in this directory. And then what images we want, and we're using a dash there to read from standard input. So we're just taking everything in that file, creating a folder, and we're going to download all of those things on my local drive. And again, all of that authentication, proxying, whatever applies to my local machine now, and I don't need to configure that on the eventual host where this is going to be running. At this point, it's just getting the raw blobs, assigning some ID to them so we know when Talos tries to fetch them what it's looking for, and then we're just going to get those locally, and we'll show that in a second. So now I have those images downloaded. I have this folder here. If I look inside of it, I can see that I have this index, OCA layout, and my blobs, and that's the actual SHA-256, and this just goes down from there where all the blobs are stored for all of those images. So now we create install media. We're actually going to use that folder, and we're going to create an ISO in this case. And I'm going to boot a machine from the ISO. You could do it for a raw disk as well if you have something like a virtualized appliance or a virtualized environment where you're going to mount a disk directly into it. But I'm going to make an ISO and show you doing it on a physical machine. And in this case, we're going to use our imager command, which we have it already created in a container image. So let's go through this here. We have a Docker run. We're going to remove it. We're going to attach the output here, and then we need to mount a bunch of directories in. This is my image cache, and I'm just putting that in the temp directory of the container. We have an out folder, which I'm going to have locally for where this ISO is going to be created. It's going to go in this _out folder. And that also goes into secure boot. If I have secure boot assets, that's going to mount that out folder into the container. There's out is going to out, and dev have a privileged container. And then here's our image that we're using, and this is imager 1.90. And now the arguments to that command are ISO is our outputs, and our image cache is temp, because remember we mapped that up here to temp. So if we run this, we're going to start creating an ISO. And I didn't specify anything else, so my default kernel command lines are a metal platform, console, all of the things I would get by default in this version of Talos. And again, this is using a Talos 1.9 because that's the installer image that I used. So I have this metal AMD ISO. Let's look in out. There it is. I have an ISO image. Now I need to send that to a USB drive. I actually don't have a CD-ROM attached to this physical machine. This would work for like virtual media if I want to attach it over a KVM and say, oh, attach this ISO, that shows up as a USB ISO device. I'm going to show you the USB process as well, because that's what I typically use to do this. So I just plugged in this 125 disk USB drive over here. It does have some partitions on it. And one of the things I want to make sure is I delete any existing partitions, because if those partitions show up on the file system when Talos tries to detect it, it might show up and detect it as a SDA, as a non-ISO formatted volume. And that's going to cause problems for me, because there's going to be a GPT partition, and the ISO image cache only works with an ISO file system. So again, that's virtual media in something like Proxmox or KVM, or an actual CD or a USB drive flashed with the ISO. So one last thing I'm going to check here is this is an SDC is the device here. So that's what I'm going to DD this to. And I'm just going to use the good old handy DD for my ISO image and then where it's going. Handy tip while you're DDing something, if you use the progress command, you can sudo progress and, you can sudo progress, the full ISO there, and you can actually see, you can watch it. So you can see how it's going, how that DD is working out. And that will just show me as it's writing, the progress command is going to display that out. It's writing very slowly here. I don't think it's going to go do that whole disk, but we'll see. There we go. Now we got it copied. So we copied it was 518 megs, got copied to the disk. And if I look at, maybe I want to see like how much my image cache is, because you could also use this for like large base images. If you're doing AI training or builds that have, you know, tens of gigabytes of files, you maybe don't want that to be pulled over the network. So I can look at my image cache here with something like DU and just say, okay, this is 418 megs on disk. And so that's how much I'm going to need eventually on Talos itself. So now let's go ahead and boot a machine from this USB drive. All right, I have this machine. It is booted up. It is a desktop. It's like HP Z series desktop. Right next to me, we can see it's in maintenance mode. I just booted it from the USB drive. And now let's look at just a couple things before we apply it. So first thing I want to look at is I want to make sure that my volumes is detected as an ISO. So in this case, we're going to do a Talos control get discovered volumes. We're going to do insecure because this is in maintenance mode, and my IP address for the endpoint. We're going to make that a lot smaller for this portion of it, just so you can see it. Down here, I see I have this runtime SDA. It's a disk, 125 gigs. It does show as an ISO 9660, which is what we want. And actually, we also require this Talos label. And I got that by default by just DDing the disk, because the ISO image has that label already attached to it. When I DD'd it, it got the label on the volume itself, because the installer for ISO is going to look for ISOs that have that label to them. So if I burn this to a physical CD, attach it to virtual media, or DD it to a USB drive, this will work. If I use something like Ventoy to just like combine a bunch of ISOs on the same disk, that's not going to work, because this is not going to show up in the same way. So now let's go ahead and create our installer here, or at least our configuration for the machine. So this is a standard Talos gen config. I have the name of the cluster that I'm going to use. I'm calling it Z because that's what this machine is. The endpoints for the Kubernetes API. I'm going to give it a couple flags here with no docs, and then set my install disk to NVMe 01, because I know this machine has that as my install disk. And the other thing I want to do here is I want to apply a patch to the system that allows me to actually use that image cache. So here we have this machine feature image cache local enabled. And what this is going to do, if this is configured, it's going to create another container of a registry, a local registry on the system that's already trusted, that is going to basically be a registry that points down to the local file system on the ISO. So it's going to, container D is going to spin up, say, give me that image. It's a pull through cache registry, and it's going to come back down to the local file system because that image already exists. If that image doesn't exist, if I'm saying, hey, I want some new image or I want an updated version, it'll still fetch that upstream. So only the files that are baked into the image are what's going to be served, and that includes every layer. If I have additional layers in the upstream registry, I will only fetch those additional layers. So let's go ahead and make a patch. We'll put this in here. And we also will need to specify the volume for this because I'm doing this from ISO. I don't have separate volumes on my hard drive on the system itself. So we are going to configure that. And this is standard Talos volume config. If you're using that from a recent Talos release, this is going to look familiar to you. And this is just specifying a disk selector, which in this case is going to be labeled as the system disk. I'm using this as image cache is the name, and it's a volume config. So let's go ahead and define this and put it in there. You can leave out this min and max size of 2 gigs. You will get basically a 1 gig volume if you leave that out, which in my case is going to be perfectly fine because my image cache is only 400 megs. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to separate those 2 documents because volume cache is a separate document here. And this is my patch. This is what I'm going to combine in with the existing patch or machine config that I have. So now we can apply this to the machine. And again, this should look very familiar to anyone that's used to Talos. I have apply command. I have my control plane because I'm going to make this a control plane machine. The endpoint with insecure because it's in maintenance mode. And here's my patch file that I just created, which is going to use that local image cache. And I'm going to see if I can't, that's not going to work so well because I'm in the way, but I'm going to watch the logs here as I push enter on this. Sometimes you can catch it. Sometimes it's a little too fast. What this actually does is it's going to copy the images from the USB, from the ISO to the local file system. So when this machine reboots or it kexecs, I can pull out the USB drive. It's no longer pulling directly from the USB drive, and it's going to be copying it from the local file system. And here we can see the top bar shows that I have some components here. We're going to be a control plane node because it says it's a type control plane. I get my host information. I'm in a booting stage still. So and I see here in the logs, I get etcd waiting to be up, right? So I haven't bootstrapped the system yet. Let's go ahead and bootstrap. To do that, I'm going to go ahead and export my Talos config that's in this directory. So I get my authentication, and I'm going to add my endpoint and node just to make it easier so I don't have to specify those things. So I have a config, Talos control, config endpoint, the IP address, and same thing for the node. Now I can just run Talos bootstrap, and that's going to automatically use the authentication from the certificate in the Talos config and the endpoint and node that I just added to the config. We see it here switch to running, and then we're going through the stages here. One thing we can look at here is services. Again, I'm going to make that smaller for you, and I can see I have this new registry D service that's running, and that's the actual local registry. So let's get logs from it. And we can see that it's getting image fetches. So I have all these info, which is just the get commands that it's using to say, hey, I need that blob, give it to me. And the local registry is serving those files directly from the local image cache. So if I didn't have internet access, it doesn't matter. I'm going to get all those things from a local image cache. If I miss an image, if I'm trying to fetch an image that I didn't bake in here, I would see an error, of a cache miss basically, and an error, and it would go fetch that from upstream. And it would go look for that image upstream. It does take a little bit longer for it to error timeout and go fetch it and then bring it in. We're going to wait for this for just another second. Oh, I just saw all the components went healthy up here in the dashboard. I'm waiting for ready to show up here. We'll probably see a burst of CNI get applied to the system. So that's Kubernetes being pulled in. And again, it's going to fetch the CNI from my image cache. So if you have an alternative CNI, if you're using Calico or Cilium or whatever, bake that into the image, and then you don't need to go fetch that from somewhere else. You don't need to get that somewhere. You can automatically get that in the system from the local hard drive. And there goes my CNI config, and I got a ready true. So I have a healthy cluster now. And let's go ahead and get the kube config from it. Let's export that as a kube config. And I can see I have the components running. Let's inspect one of them. Let's see where it came from, right? Because I'm using a local image cache. What does it actually look like? So let's just grab the core DNS one. And if I look at my images or image, I will see here that this still shows the upstream registry. I didn't have to modify where those are coming from, because again, this local registry D is acting as a pull-through cache, not as the actual endpoint for where the container comes from. So in this case, it looked at the local pull-through cache. Hey, do you have this image? Yes, I did have it on disk. I didn't have to worry about that. But then I can go fetch it upstream if you don't have it. And finally, let's look at the get image cache config, which is an object that's part of Talos now with 1.9, and it shows me a couple different things here. It'll show me that I have a copy status of ready, and so that actually says we copied it off of the ISO. If you're using the full disk image, this is going to say skipped, because I didn't need to copy it from anywhere. And then it's showing me my roots of where this came from. So I have my system disk, which is the thing that I originally copied to, and then my ISO image cache, which is where it came from. So if I need to upgrade this, or if I need to update this image, update the images in the cache, I can actually put a new ISO with new images locally on this disk. And if I plug that in as an ISO, Talos will use that. It'll automatically say, hey, I'm looking for this ISO. Do I have that on disk? If so, I can update things with SneakerNet. Now, I don't need to have a full registry in air-gapped environments. I can do the USB flow. So that's it for this video. I just wanted to explain what that looks like, how to use the image cache, and maybe when you might want to use it and how to troubleshoot it a bit. So this is just using a standard container pull-through cache that gets automatically configured when you say to use this in the configuration. This is still an opt-in feature. You still have to declare that in your machine config, but it does give you an option if you're doing something in a slow internet, air-gapped environments, or you just want to kind of pre-bake this stuff in. Let's say you're trying to scale up to 500 nodes real quick. You might bake this in so that you just don't need to download gigs and gigs of information on all those machines. It's just baked into the disk and it's ready to go. Thanks everyone for watching. And if you have any questions, please feel free to join our Slack or reach out to us on GitHub with discussions or issues if you find problems with it. And we'll see you next time.